In early 1932, a young American man came to Peking.
Approaching Peking by rail across the brown winter plain in 1932 still had the emotional impact it had had during the 500 years since the city walls were built. For Peking, until the 1960s, was the world's most populous walled city.
John Fairbank, a PhD student from Oxford, came to Peking to complete his PhD thesis. He conducted his research in a number of Qing Dynasty customs archives. This 25-year-old scholar had only recently shifted his academic focus to this faraway Asian nation. Soon, his fiancée, Wilma, joined him in Peking, and they were married in a pretty courtyard. The bride had graduated from Radcliffe College of Harvard University with a degree in fine arts, and she was fascinated by Chinese art. After they arrived, John Fairbank was busy with various academic activities and with his study of Chinese. Wilma, together with her younger sister Marion, who was visiting them, painted Peking.
I remember so well that train trip, because this was Chinese New Year, so everybody was so dressed up, and all the children had on these little padded coats, the boys did, and the little lion shoes. Remember the shoes that they had? And of course, all those hutongs in Peking, I don't know whether any of them are left, are they?
Some of them.
I hope they're saving them. Well, I tell you, I remember it so well that I first met Liang Sicheng and his wife on a I remember it was a very cold January night. And I remember how charming, how warm and charming they were and friendly they were, and how beautiful she was, too.
Some 2 months after our wedding, we met Liang Sicheng and his wife, Huiyin. Neither they nor we were aware that years of close friendship lay ahead, but we were captivated from the first.
In 1932, the newly wedded Fairbanks met Liang and Lin in Peking. The Chinese couple was well acquainted with both Boston, where Wilma had lived, and London, where John Fairbank had been studying. They had recently begun to thoroughly research the architecture of this ancient nation. Liang Sicheng gave Chinese names to their new American friends. John was called Fei Jiangqing, and Wilma Fei Weimei. In 1932, when the Fairbanks first entered Liang and Lin's lives, Huiyin had just given birth to their second child. Their baby son was named Tongji, in commemoration of Li Jie, the author of Building Standards, the masterpiece of ancient Chinese. They had moved to Peking from the Northeast 1 year earlier, and they were renting the No. 3 courtyard on Beizongbu Lane.
This house had 2 lovely little courtyards. I remember as a young girl when Mom held both my hands while we walked in the backyard. Because the windowsill was low, the winter sun could penetrate deep into the room. The plum blossoms in front of the window that Mom so loved, the clay animal figures, the sofa, and the painting and the calligraphy on the walls were all bathed in sunshine.
As the eldest Liang brother, Sicheng, together with his wife Huiyin, were responsible for taking care of the younger brothers and sisters. Many friends and relatives would visit the Liang courtyard.
My entry into the life of the household was regarded with suspicion by the mother and the servants. Despite these misgivings, my comings and goings were in time accepted. I often went over to the Liangs at the end of the day by bicycle or rickshaw. I would walk through the inner garden to find Wei. Settled in a cozy corner of the living room with cups of hot tea, we hastened to relate the stories or thoughts we had been saving for each other.
I did not think once that I could have a friend in a woman. It is my luck to have met you, because otherwise I may never know and enjoy this certain warm flow of feelings between two women.
The correspondence between Liang and Lin and the Fairbanks began from when they first met in Peking.
这封信是写给 Wilma 和 John 的，是他称呼是 Dearest Wilma and Darling John. Phyllis. Love. 都是 Phyllis 签名的。我们叫 Wilma 叫费姨。这个小弟是我，宝宝是梁在斌，我姐姐。
But the Liangs filled a role in our experience of China that made a great difference to us. And any account of Wilma and me as cultural intermediaries must include them, as well as their close friend and neighbor, Professor Y.L. Chin.
Jin Yulin, a Tsinghua professor, was 6 years older than Sicheng. He had studied business at the Wardens School of the University of Pennsylvania. Due to a shift in interest, he entered Columbia University and then London University to study politics and philosophy. Later, he became a logician. Jin returned to China to establish the Department of Philosophy at Tsinghua University. Beginning when they both lived on Beizongbu Lane, he was almost always the Liang's neighbor, and he became their best friend. Today, the number 3 courtyard on Beizongbu Lane has become the number 24 courtyard in Beijing. In the 1930s, the 2 neighboring courtyards held frequent weekend parties. The Liangs and Jin were the hosts, and the visitors were mostly returnees from the UK or the US. In addition, some literary novices also joined them. Timidly, I followed Mr. Shen Chongwen into that famous ladies' parlor on Zhongbu Lane. This was the first time I met Lin Huiyin. The first thing she said to me was, "You write with true emotion. That is very precious." I was greatly encouraged. When she spoke, no one could interrupt. However, her talkativeness was nothing like the gossip of a married woman. Rather, it always consisted of well-grounded, insightful, and incisive critiques.
年轻人来这里倾听一位女子的妙语连珠，人所共知她的爽直前卫，拥有天赋、天分和聪明。哦，她讨厌做聪明人，她激情无限，创造力无限。她的诗意不仅仅是她能写诗歌，她敏锐的感受力和鉴赏力，总之，人所渴求的她应有尽有，除却学究气。学究气的反面是丰富多彩。一个人学究气越重，就越丧失色彩。我宁愿自己更富于色彩，看看徽因是多么丰富多彩，而可怜的我，如此苍白，彻头彻尾的苍白。
She was creatively gifted as a writer, a poet, a woman of great aesthetic sensitivity and broad intellectual interests, and socially charming. The household, or any scene she was in, tended to revolve around her.
我妈这个人呢，很爱说话，这是她很健谈。所以人家都说她这个，都记得她也到了什么人多的时候，好像就我妈一个人在那儿说。她是能侃侃而谈。她为什么爱说呢？我也想了想，她的这个思维的方式跟我父亲不大一样。我父亲是想很多事情，他自己心里想，你看你不知道他在想什么。我妈可不一样，我妈是一边想一边说，就是她的思维过程你可以看得见的。所以后来在这个我在想我妈1955年去世啊，正好是我们大搞政治运动之前，她那个劲儿啊，你恐怕要到碰到运动，恐怕是够她受的，也是。
我认为最愉快的事都是一闪亮的，在一段较短的时间内蹦出神奇的，如同两个人透彻的了解，一句话打到你心里，使得你理智和情感全觉到1000000分满足，如同相爱。在一个时候里，你同你自身以外另一个人互相以彼此存在为极端的幸福，如同恋爱，在那时那刻，眼所见，耳所听，心所触，无所不是美丽，如诗歌自然的流动，如花香那样不知其所以。我说你是人间的4月天，笑响点亮了四面风，清灵在春的光艳中交舞着变。你是4月早天里的云烟，黄昏吹着风的软，星子在无意中闪，细雨点洒在花前。
This was the best time in Lin Huiyin's entire life. She was committed to writing, and she was impassioned by familial love and friendship, and by a constant urge to think and to create.
那清，那平庭，你是鲜艳百花的冠冕，你戴着。你是天真、庄严，你是夜夜的月圆。你是一树一树的花开，是燕在梁间呢喃。你是爱，是暖，是诗的一篇。你是人间的4月天。
In 1928, Nanjing became the new capital of the Republic of China, which was then a country unified in name but split by the ongoing warfare among the warlords. In the south, the power of communism was beginning to rise. On the horizon, China's ferocious neighbor, Japan, with its ambitions to invade, was looming large. However, it was during this period that China's national capitalism was advancing rapidly and creating the so-called Golden Decade. Against this backdrop walked a number of architectural scholars. Loaded with backpacks of sustenance and measuring instruments, they were en route to discover ancient Chinese architecture. We arrived at the bus station before 5 o'clock, but the bus did not arrive until 7. The station was located in the middle of a pig market, where all the pigs for daily consumption in Beiping were allocated and transported. So, with the wailing of over 2,000 pigs that day, we got on the bus and left Chaoyunmen. The first thing we did after we got off the bus was to look for a hotel. The places we saw were infested with flies, and the cattle were fed right below the windows. Farmers by the roadside lifted pails of water from the well, which drew us over for a drink. However, the water was full of floating things, and we had to move ahead without quenching our thirst.
Sizhuang, we have been out for 2 weeks, and now it is time to return. I am willing to take whatever transportation at whatever time. We had to trot in deep sweat to visit each site, and it was always between 8 and 6, the hottest time of the day. During the past 3 days, we have all become exhausted, and we have been poorly fed. We're less energetic than we were last week. Tormented by fleas, we were too timid to catch them while seated in third-class train. So we ended up with bites all over us.
Every new discovery during their journey offered a panacea for all their trials and tribulations. The Amitabha in front of the Sutra Storage Hall still greeted us with a smile. Behind it, we crossed the platform to move upward. There we found the upper structure of the Sutra Hall consisting of exquisite bracket sets that were exactly the same as those in building standards, along with many other remarkable constructions. We were in ecstasy.
When we arrived in Shanxi, the azure of the sky was nearly transparent, and the flowing clouds were mesmerizing. The corner of a temple and a pagoda in the sunset. The beauty of such scenery pierced my heart and even hurt a little.
As I looked up, I saw no ceiling in the hall, what the building standards called creating a penetrating bright revelation. The intricate structure of the beams and lintel are without parallel in later architecture. My disappointment vanished at once to be replaced by joy. Within a few months after we discovered the Temple of Solitary Joy in Ji County, another piece of Liao architecture was discovered. My share of the happiness was indeed oversized.
The teacher came, as did the soldiers with their horses, and several women stood at the side, a bit shy, hand in hand, to watch us. Children fought to watch us taking photos, measuring facades, and the teachers helped us to copy the script on the tome. How many years had it seen? They asked us with pride. Many, many, we answered happily. About 1,400 years. 1,400 years! Then we all took pride in the temple. 是水笑得那样甜，那样深，那样圆转，一串一串明珠，大小闪着光亮，蹦出天真。清泉的浮动泛流到水面上，璀璨分散。是谁笑成这100层塔高耸，让不知名鸟雀来盘旋？是谁笑成这万千个风铃的转动，从每一层琉璃的岩边摇上云天
？Time and again, ancient architecture in various parts of China was discovered by these tenacious scholars, and the photos, measurements, and records in their field reports were pleasant surprises. However, during this time of war and turbulence, the best use for these buildings was to house soldiers and to store sustenance for the army. In conservative towns, some people were inspired by fashion to try to modernize the ancient architecture. As a result, the original masterpiece was destroyed by stupidity and arrogance. Such attempts at destruction often first targeted the carved windows, doors, and screens. It was a rare opportunity for us to discover a real masterpiece, beautiful and intact, and unscathed by nature or man. After all, a spark could bring down an entire temple.
As the whole nation and its culture are confronting a crisis, those well informed about the ancient arts are saddened. If we fail to sort out and protect the legacy of our ancestors and allow those treasures to be spoiled, or even to be sold to second-hand shops, it will only prove the irrevocable fall of our morality and intelligence. To put it simply, recently, a number of devoted architects have given up their prospects of benefiting from building Western houses to travel around China and to discover and measure the great works of their counterparts who lived hundreds of years earlier.
In the autumn of 1933, after Lin Huiyin's essay was published, Liang Sicheng, Liu Dunjian, and Mo Zongjiang, who were traveling in Shanxi, reached the wooden pagoda in Ying County. Today, we visited the pagoda of Fugong Temple, a sight that immediately took my breath away. My first response was to lament that you were not here to share it with me. Had you been here, I cannot imagine how enamored you would have been with it. The pagoda is unparalleled in its greatness. No one can imagine such a possibility of a wooden construction before setting eyes on it. I admire it from the bottom of my heart, the pagoda and its master and nameless architect in an age of old. Another Liao period building, the wooden pagoda, was built in 1038 AD. As old as the Buddha Sutra Hall that Japanese scholars claimed to be the oldest in China. This wooden pagoda was the only one of its kind. Lin Huiyin wrote, "The evolution of Chinese architecture remains a riddle. Until now, no Tang wooden construction has been found in China, while the building standards of the Song dynasty still contain some indecipherable mysteries. The Liao period between the Tang and the Song left us some remarkable wooden pagoda, mansion, and Buddha and Sutra halls, which offered us clues about the transition between the different ages. This was indeed a great thing for those few committed modern architects."
它经历了将近1000年地震呀、人为的破坏呀、自然力量的这风力、风雨是这个对它的冲击，它都没有损害了。也就你们看到咱们台阶上那个角兽的风化不完整了，但是木头反而在这儿什么问题没有。说它这个木构件已经经过1000年的互相挤压、咬合，扭成一个整体了。结构上有很多神奇的地方。
州的管辖范围。
游客来一般最关心什么？它这个倾斜，它会不会让还能登几年？会不会马上就不让登了？最关心就是它这个倾斜维修情况。专家预测近100-200年肯定是没有问题，但是100-200年不修没问题，但是有人踩它，这个就很难说。
The photos were all taken and the 10 plans were all measured in great detail to save labor for future graphing efforts. Tomorrow, the bracket sets and facades will be measured. Again, I will have to climb the walls and ride the eaves, but since my legs have already been well tested, I am not afraid of more challenges. A year before Liang Sicheng went to the U.S. to study, one of his legs was slightly handicapped in a car accident. But this never hampered his work examining ancient Chinese architecture. Every journey involved a lot of photographing, and yet the most important and difficult task was the surveying and mapping of the architecture to produce a complete set of graphs for each building. These are some of the architectural maps preserved from that time. Today, they are housed in the School of Architecture of Tsinghua University.
那之所以测稿的是这个了。你首先
利用你凭你的眼睛，凭你的平时训练的技巧，你把这个门的样子把它画下来，没有尺寸画下来。但是功夫就在你画的出来的比例跟它实际比例都差不多才行，这就是功夫。画下来以后，然后用尺子去量，一点一点量，第一个尺寸什么，第二个尺寸，第三个尺寸，第四个尺寸。那么这个尺寸要求的很细。你看它是木结构，特别琐碎。就拿那个斗拱来讲，斗拱它是一点一点小木头拼起来的，你要把它画很不容易画，你要测绘也很不容易。
These surveys and maps taken back from each field trip became the foundation for the fine architectural crafts we can see at last. Between 1932 and 1937, the members of the Institute for Research on Chinese Architecture traversed Hubei, Shanxi, Shanxi, Henan, Shandong, Liaoning, Hunan, Zhejiang, and Jiangsu. They surveyed and mapped over 200 architectural structures in various parts of China, completing 1,898 graphs and leaving a precious treasure for the study of Chinese architecture.
If not for Liang and his wife Lin and Liu Dunzhan and others, Mo Zongjiang was one of them, they took very seriously the responsibility to find the past, to write about it, to identify it before it was lost. If not for Liang Sicheng, possibly the 20 very early buildings, the buildings that date before the year 1100, or the hundreds of old buildings, that is, buildings that survived before the year 1400, would be in very poor condition or even have been destroyed.
他们做研究中国建筑这个事情，其实真正最大的贡献是，帮我们建立了中国建筑的一个学术体系，这个才是真正重大的事情。自从有了营造学社之后，有了这些工作成果之后，很少有西方学者在做中国建筑研究的时候说不顾中国人的研究成果，会显得非常愚蠢。
In the 1930s, Chinese society gradually came to acknowledge the importance of excavating and examining the ancient relics. In 1935, the Old Capital Cultural Relics Committee was established in Beiping. Liang Sicheng and Liu Dunzhan were selected as technical advisors, and many ancient architectural structures in Beiping began to undergo restoration. Yang Tingbao was in charge of restoring the Qinyan Hall of the Temple of Heaven. As advisors, Liang Sicheng and Lin Huiyin took this photo on the roof of Qinyan Hall.
And it's here that I was able to track down a lot of some of the most exciting finds of that time they were together in China, and in particular this lovely book that she pulled together called A Summer, 1934. And it's very cute. She calls it the deluxe edition. Hand-drawn, hand-typed, and the text was by my mother and the photographs were by Liang Sicheng, and my father apparently took some of these photos as well.
In 1934, they planned to meet near the Yudao River in Shanxi to spend the summer together. The Fairbanks followed Liang and Lin on a field trip to discover ancient architecture in southern Shanxi. The days they spent together brought the two couples even closer.
Among these pictures should be identified the following occupants of the Shanxi summer 1934. 2 graduate architects, 2 inventive culinary experts, a historian, a painter, an accomplished photographer, a correspondent of the Tianjin Takong Pao, an expert packer, her deadly rival in the art, an early riser, a less early riser, 2 even less early risers. Our time with Sicheng had been relatively limited in Peking, but here we 4 ate 3 meals a day together and discovered the first day that he loved hot peppery dishes. This quiet, self-contained man scintillated at the table. Villagers along the way stared at us as usual and irritated Phyllis and Sicheng by asking them what country they came from. They couldn't understand Chinese and foreigners traveling together. While we were gaping at China, modern China gaped at this marvel of Henry Ford's.
While traveling, Huiyin was writing a newspaper article, Beyond the Window, to describe the world beyond her reach. The 1930s marked the peak of Lin Huiyin's literary career. In 1934, she published her novel 99. Li Jianwu, a literary critic, said, "In an era when even men could not contain their passions, a woman writer such as Huiyin, through her rational and penetrating eyes, took a clear photo of life and presented it in such concise words." In 1936, for its 10th anniversary, the Tianjin Takong Po invited Lin Huiyin to edit the art section on selected novels. She was also employed by the Department of Foreign Languages of the Women's School of Beiping University to teach English literature. Her students commented, "Her English was fluent and pleasant to the ears. Her teaching style was easy and alive. She spoke with wit and humor and without any pretension. It was an event every time she arrived at the school. Modern, pretty, and yet simple and elegant." Some joked that no one would come to listen to the lecture had it been a men's school. As Mr. Ho Renjie, then a student at Liangs University, remembered, in the autumn of 1934, Lin Huiyin lectured on China's pagodas. I decided to attend not really out of any interest in pagodas, but out of curiosity about her fame. I could never have imagined that this wonderful lecture would inspire my love of ancient architectural art. Later on, I read Miscellany on Beiping's suburban construction, written by Liang Sicheng and Lin Huiyin, which echoed the themes in that lecture. Any lofty ancient tower or foundation of a fallen hall possesses a soul that speaks of the incredible changes over time. It speaks of beautiful romance, as well as bloodthirsty massacre. It speaks with a sensibility that belongs to poetry and painting, and yet, as we architects proclaim, a sensibility even beyond, which must be called architecturalism, a term that has to be coined to do it justice. The time that was left for Liang and Lin and for the Institute of Research on Chinese Architecture was very limited. In 1931, the Japanese occupied Manchuria. A few years later, they began to invade North China.
他说，当时日本人进攻中国，好像已经这个企图已经很明显了。他说我和梁先生两个都清楚地认识到，我们必须在最短的时间里面把这个 华北的古建筑、重要的古建筑全部调查，否则就来不及了。
On December 9th, 1935, a student movement broke out in Beiping against the so-called self-autonomy of North China staged by the Japanese. Warfare loomed over China. At the end of the year, the Fairbanks prepared to end their 4-year-long visit in China and return home.
In December 1935, no fortitude was required of us. Wilma and I were going on our way to a happier world.
You see, I was biculturally brought up, and there is no denying that bicultural contact and activity is essential to me. Before you two really came into our lives here at number 3, I was always somewhat lost and had a sense of lack somewhere, a certain spiritual poverty that needed nourishing. The picnics and riding this autumn, or rather early winter, made a whole world of difference to me.
Leaving friends like the Liangs was traumatic. We had learned from each other and given each other all we could. Phyllis had become the closest friend to both of us. Our departure was a real heartbreak.
4 years earlier, the two couples had met by chance in Beiping. The first time they parted, they were each about to start the best chapters of their lives. Years later, when they met again, the Fairbanks were setting off to reach the peaks of their careers. Yet their best Chinese friends had already finished the best part of their journey. Thereafter, their lives would be spent in incessant warfare and political campaigns, and disease and torture would accompany them until the very end of their lives. In the summer of 1937, Liang Sicheng and Lin Huiyin entrusted their daughter and son to Liang's elder sister Sushun. Together with Mo Zongjiang and others, they embarked on their 3rd trip to Shanxi. Years of field trips had unearthed numerous ancient Chinese architectural structures, which were then surveyed, mapped, and graphed. There was, however, a lingering disappointment. Was it true that one could see wooden architecture of the Tang Dynasty only in Japan, the Horyuji in Nara, the pride and joy of Japanese scholars? Over the past 6 years, Liang Sicheng had prayed on each journey that they would encounter a miracle. In the summer of 1937, Liang Sicheng took a book by the French scholar Paul Pellois on a trip to Shanxi. He identified an important clue from it. Based on that clue, Liang would search for his dream of discovering extant Tang architecture on Wutai Mountain. We rode on mules. The roads were steep and serpentine. Times we passed near the edge of cliffs, a danger that we had to endure. Plowed fields followed the turns in the mountain, in which a great variety of forests flourished. It took them 2 days on the mountain roads to reach Dou village in Taiwei. At dusk, a temple reflecting the beautiful sunlight stood in front of them. This was the Zhenrongchan Temple of Buddha's Light, the Temple of Buddha's Light on the Dunhuang fresco. Liang described his feeling as startled by surprise, sighing with happiness upon entering the main hall of the Buddha Light Temple. The hall had only 1 level, with gigantic brackets, simple and majestic, and eaves hanging deep and reaching far. With a glimpse, it could be immediately concluded that the hall was of ancient provenance. But would it be the oldest architectural structure dating earlier than all known construction? The space below the ceiling of the hall was like a dark, empty loft. We climbed up there through the gap below the eaves. Inches of dust were piled on the floor, which, when we stepped onto it, felt like cotton. By torchlight, we could see thousands of bats jostling on the lintel, and they were hard to drive away. When we took photos, the scared bats took flight from the flashes and stirred up an unbearable stench. Millions of bed bugs hid in the timber. Our work there was real torment. Only after days did we find hints of ink at the bottom of the beam in the hall. They finally discovered the characters which proved that the Temple of the Buddha's Light had been built in 857 AD, during the Dazhong period of the Tang Dynasty. A great discovery had been made. This is the only wooden structure of the Tang Dynasty that we have been searching for years. It is not only the crown of ancient Chinese architecture, but stands as a treasure from China's feudal cultural legacy. The hall is a Tang construction. Moreover, it houses precious Tang statues, paintings, and ink. 4 arts in one. The Temple of Buddha's Light is indeed a rarity among the extant relics. This was the most splendid day in the lives of Liang and Lin, and yet, from this day onwards, their fates began to change. Their daughter, who was then in Beidaihe, received a letter from her mother.
Baby, Mommy doesn't know how to tell you so many things, so I will tell you them one by one. We first took a carriage and then rode mules as we moved slowly. We were very busy, so we did not reach Dai County until July the 12th. There, we could buy newspapers and send telegrams, and we began to learn a bit about the news.
On July 12, 1937, Liang and Lin left Wutai Mountain. It was only then that they learned that 5 days earlier, when they were still immersed in the ecstasy of discovering the Temple of Buddha's Light, the July 7th incident had taken place in Beiping.
Now I will tell you why the Japanese made trouble for us this time. You know, they always coveted our North China, and this time they again invented an excuse to attack us with their huge army. We hope things can be settled without a war, but if the Japanese insist on occupying Beiping, we are all willing to fight. Then you can stay with your aunt, and we will stay in Beiping until the war is won. I feel that now, as Chinese, we must be brave and fear nothing. We must live and fight with determination.
Liang Sicheng's dream was realized, but at the same time, a nightmare was being unleashed. Overnight, the long-brewing July 7th incident would change the lives of all Chinese.